thank you, first of all, for inviting me here. It has been a great pleasure to be here. I have had a lot of nice discussions yesterday evening with my friends here, and I have enjoyed everything so far. Also, thank you, Carles, for the nice words on Finland. I think that everything looks a little bit better when looking from outside. And that's why I have put a little bit different heading on my presentation. There are maybe two reasons why I have a question mark there, and I'm asking whether we are still banking or relying on knowledge. The first is, of course, that you made the benchmarking trip to Finland in 2006, and many things have changed since then. And another thing is, of course, that we had a major crisis in Finland in the early 1990s, and there was a clear innovation policy response to the crisis at that time. And now we are in the middle of a new crisis, and my question is, do we still bank on knowledge, or is there a response by the innovation policies also to this current crisis? So I will be comparing a little bit the two crises, the crisis of the early 90s and the crisis of the current crisis. So this talk today, my talk today, will follow the structure given here. I will use a little bit the same data Carles used in his presentation, but I tried to give some interpretations to the numbers. I start with saying a few words about Finland as a country and as a society, and then something about why knowledge is, or knowledge creation and innovation is so important. And the obvious answer is, of course, that is the main source of economic growth and well-being, and that's one of the guiding lines for the Finnish policies. Then I will go to the Finnish economy in the 21st century. We experienced a very rapid growth, but we were hit quite hard by the recession or the crisis, as showed by Carles just a few minutes ago. And the question is, of course, how do we recover from this crisis, and how does it compare to the crisis of the early 90s? So I will talk mainly about innovation policy responses. I will also say something about macro policy responses, and we can come back to that in the discussion. But as I understood, I was invited here to talk mainly from the point of view of innovation policies. So there are certain differences when we compare the crisis of the early 90s and the current crisis, and I will come back to that. But in addition to that, I will take the longer-term issue. I think that also during the crisis, however bad they may look like, you have to think about the longer term at the same time, because the short-term actions, the measures, have also longer-term implications. And I think that the crisis in Finland in the early 90s is a good example of that. So when responding to the crisis of the early 90s, the longer-term objectives were clearly taken into account, and I will say a few words about that. Another reason of talking about longer-term issues and innovation policies is that Finland launched a new innovation strategy in 2008 when the current government started its term, and after launching the strategy, there was a major evaluation of the Finnish innovation system. I was heavily involved myself in the international evaluation. It was coordinated by my institute, and I was one of the coordinators of that exercise. We paid attention in the evaluation to some of the new features in our innovation system, and especially we emphasize that while we are at the frontier, and I mean that now that we are at the productivity frontier and also a technology frontier in many fields, we need to change the policies. We are not anymore catching up type of an economy, and there is a certain difference, or a profound difference actually, in policies whether you are catching up or whether you are at the frontier. And then I'll try to conclude. But these are my topics today, and we can come back to many of the questions later after my presentation. But let's go through Finland in a nutshell. I think that there is no need to repeat some of the basic figures. I think that the most important thing here is to say that Finland is a Nordic country. We are a group of maybe 4 or 5 Nordic countries. And the Baltic countries, as we heard just a few minutes ago, would like to join the Nordic club. They are more than welcome. But the Nordic countries share a certain socio-economic model. We can talk about the Nordic socio-economic model, which includes, for example, very even income distribution, low class distinctions, but also a large public sector which is providing extensive safety networks. And that is combined to the openness of the economy, which all the Nordic countries are today. They are very globalized. And that means that we need the social safety net for the shocks coming from the global economy. And that's one reason for having such a large public sector. A large public sector is also important from the point of view of the current crisis. And that is simply because if you have a large public sector, the so-called automatic stabilizers play a very big role when responding to the crisis. Automatically, when the GDP drops, when there is a decline in the economic activity, it means that the public expenditure start to rise. So there is an automatic response to the crisis, in the sense that we have a lot of income transfers that are related to the economic situation, so the unemployment benefits, for example. So it means that in the case of countries with large public sector, there is less need for active counter-cyclical measures, because the system itself takes care part of the responses. So in that sense, I will say a few words later also about macroeconomic responses to the crisis, and we see that this is an important aspect. Maybe something about culture. I think that the culture is trusting and cooperative. There's high social cohesion. And as emphasized by Carles, there has been also tendency towards consensus-driven decision-making. And I have put there a question mark and asking whether that is changing. And I'm referring now to the current political situation in Finland. Because of the European financial crisis, there is a new populist party, or a populist party that has been actually existing for a couple of decades already, but it has gained a lot of support during the last few years because of the European financial crisis. They get their support by criticizing the bailout arrangements and putting taxpayers' money to bail out the countries who have been irresponsible with their economies. And that has, in a way, challenged the old or the system of the traditional parties, and maybe to some extent also the consensus-based decision-making. But I think that it is still there, and we can say that there is this tendency to rely consensus, especially during the hard times. But this is more or less Finland in a nutshell, and then something about the economy. All the Nordic countries, as I said, if we want to say something about Finland, I would like to say that it is part of the Nordic family, and that's why I'm comparing often Finland with other Nordic countries. What is common with all the Nordic countries is that they are very globalized, they are very open to the rest of the world, which was not the case actually with Finland in the 1980s, but since then the economy has been opening up very quickly. And at the same time, as I said, there is all the Nordic countries have a relatively high tax rate, tax burden, which has to do with the openness of the economy in the way I just explained, that we need high social safety nets, which implies high taxes, if we are part of the global economy. Because we are sensitive to shocks coming from the global economy, and they are seen in the great fluctuations in incomes, and against those fluctuations we need the social safety net. Of course, there is also an ideological background here. I mean that all the Nordic countries aim to be or aim to combine two things. They want to be welfare states with low class distinctions, and at the same time they want to be dynamic, technologically and economically dynamic societies. So they want to combine technological and economic dynamism with high social cohesion. And that's a dilemma we are all facing, and everybody's, or there is a constant seek for balance between the two, because if we face very low income differences, they might be detrimental for creating economic incentives, which we need for being dynamic economies or keep the dynamism going on. But this is the kind of trade-off we have to face, and I think that all the Nordic countries have succeed in finding the right balance so far. But the question is always asked, to what extent there should be bigger income differences in order to have also economic incentives for individuals. Then the more principal consideration, why is knowledge creation and innovation so important? Well, the simple answer is that if you look at how those countries who have been ranked innovative are performing in terms of GDP per capita or in terms of economic growth, we always come up with this type of graphs. Of course, this does not imply any causality, but it's in accordance with all the research results we have. So we can say that knowledge, innovation, knowledge capital is in the long run the main explanation for economic growth and well-being, no doubt about that. And how do you create the kind of knowledge that is needed for economic growth is something I try to discuss during the next 20-30 minutes. But this is, in a nutshell, the reason why we should be so concerned, why should we think so much about knowledge creation and innovation. If we are concerned about economic well-being, we should be also thinking about how to make the societies and economies knowledge more and more knowledge-driven and use more and more innovation. As a matter of fact, if you look at this, there is an outlier, one of the Nordic countries, namely Norway, which is an outlier here. And the regression line has been drawn without Norway, by the way. But anyway, Norway has oil, and that's the main explanation, of course, for their very, very high living standards. Otherwise, Norway is very similar to other Nordic countries. And we envy, of course, Norway for their oil reserves, but at the same time, I know that in Norway there is also a very long-term horizon to look at what after the oil booms. They are all the time thinking that oil will be run out one day, and when that happens, they have to be prepared by developing and creating by developing their knowledge base. So if we look at the innovation performance then of different countries and take the small country issue here, we can see that by using the European Union Innovation Scoreboard data, here the composite indicator which puts together many kinds of indicators of innovativeness, we can see that it's usually the small countries that are on the top of these kind of lists. For example, the Nordic countries are there. But on the other hand, of course, there are other smaller countries who are at the other end of the spectrum, but some of the smaller countries are doing well. So this is the composite indicator which puts together many of the innovation indicators. For example, these kind of indicators, if we take Finland as a separate case and see where we deviate most from the rest of the EU countries, we can see that it's the human resources, so the educational system is functioning well, as you said. Also, linkages to other innovation actors and agencies are very important. I will come back to that later. And also finance and support. There are some areas like innovators where we are not doing that well. And that means that the number of people making inventions and patenting is not that high, but still a bit higher than the EU average. I won't say that much about that, but maybe that has something to do with the incentives, which I was referring to a few minutes ago. So we don't see that many individuals who invent something, become rich later, establish a business, etc. So that is one of the weaknesses in the system. But anyway, this is giving you a rough picture that Finland is doing well in almost in all dimensions of innovation, and especially in terms of human resources or educational capital and linkages to other agencies in the system. So we are always talking in Finland about innovation system. Actually, the concept was introduced in Finland already in the early 1990s, only a couple of years after it was introduced by some of the academic scholars, and it was adopted very early on. So all the policymakers started to think in terms of a system. So we think that there is always an interaction between different agencies within the public sector, but also an interaction between the public and the private sector. So the kind of thinking innovation as a systemic phenomenon has been adopted quite early on in Finland. Then to the current crisis and responses to the crisis, I say a few words about that. So rapid growth until the 2008. Here is a longer-term perspective, which at the same time gives you an idea of the general living standards in Finland. So we are a bit above the OECD average, but it also tells you the story of the true crises or recessions, the recession of the early 1990s, when the GDP fell by more than 10%. The recession lasted several years, 3 years about. There was 3 consequent years when the GDP fell. The unemployment rose close to 20%. And then if you compare what happened then to the current crisis, it's very different. This time there was a sharp decline in the GDP, but also the recovery has been very fast. So it's different. It's a V-shape recession at that time, and this time, and I will say a few words about the differences and how to cope with the current situation. But first, if we take the current crisis, we can say that Finland, the Finnish economy, was really hit hard by the crisis. So the GDP fell by 8.2%, as already shown by Carles, but it grew by 3.1% in 2010, and the forecast for this year is much higher than in your slides. It's about 4%, and we already have gained more or less the 2.5% growth. So the rest is only to look at what is happening. So the growth will be at least 4% this year. That means that the economy has recovered relatively fast from the crisis. But the reason for the sharp decline is simply the drop in exports, implying that the Finnish economy is very vulnerable and sensitive to the shocks coming from the world market, which of course is an outcome of the openness of the economy. You showed that exports in relation to GDP is more than 60% in Finland, and we are very dependent on especially on the European market and also on Asian market. But this decline in exports is due to the drop of exports to the European market. So this is gives you the picture of the change in export volume over the most acute phase of the crisis, so starting from the second quarter of 2009 going to 2008 going to the second quarter of 2009. And the exports fell in Finland by more than in any other OECD country, so around 30%, which explain, of course, almost or totally the drop in GDP. And that was due to drop of exports in many industries, also in ICT industry, in electronics. So, and that also implies some structural changes in the Finnish economy. The role of Nokia and telecom electronics is not that important anymore after the crisis. So there was also a structural element in the crisis. I may say something about that later. But anyway, the role of Nokia and the role of telecommunication electronics is now much smaller than it was before the crisis. So that is one of the outcomes of the crisis. So the two crises different in many ways, but similar also in some sense. Comparing the two crises is what I will say next, and I say a few words about the general responses, but also a few words about or more about the responses to by the innovation policies. A few guiding principles first. If we think about innovation policies in crisis, I think that the most important thing is that accumulated knowledge stock should not be lost during the crisis, or you should avoid of losing it as much as possible. I mean that if the flow of new inventions stops, that will be detrimental for the long-term growth. So that's one of the basic principles. So it's you have to remember that the stock of knowledge is mostly in the heads of those engaged. It means that people must be kept as possible, as much as possible, engaged also during the crisis, keep their jobs or keep them engaged in other ways. So the generation and use of new ideas and inventions should continue, and that is important, if only that is possible. And at the same time, you should not prevent the so-called creative destruction to happen. I mean that crisis is always an opportunity. It is time for renewal, and it means that there is also always an opportunity to increase the mobility of labor force during the crisis, and that is actually what is happening in Finland at the moment. People are moving from Nokia, from ICT manufacturing to IT services very quickly. We have been following what happens to the people who leave Nokia and other ICT manufacturing companies. Most of them go to IT services, and that's an opportunity which is related to the crisis. There is also a principle that you should focus maybe more on individuals, on those who make the innovations. So that's maybe less on the firms and organizations in general, more on individuals in order to make this renewal happen. Keeping the old jobs, unprofitable jobs in firms who are not profitable is not right policies. The right policies is to try to encourage people to move to firms and plants and units and jobs that are sustainable in the long run. And then more concretely to the Finnish case and the two crises. So if one wants to make a rough comparison with the two crises, I think that it's more or less like this. So the crisis of the early 1990s, to which Carlos was referring to, and what is maybe the reason why I am here, that was a domestic financial crisis mainly. We had booming global demand right after the crisis, and the strategy was export-led recovery and re-industrialization of the country. Actually, at that time, Nokia grew very rapidly, all the major industries grew very rapidly, and there was a kind of a re-industrialization period in Finland. We were swimming against the common current of the OECD countries, where the role of manufacturing is diminishing, but in the latter part of the 90s, the role of manufacturing in Finland was increasing very rapidly, actually. So there was also a clear policy change in Finland, and I was very much involved in doing that, because we were talking about the role of micro-based policies very much at that time. Micro-based policies means now educational policies and innovation policies, maybe industrial policies, but not in the way that we should support or subsidize industries, but renew industry, so the positive industrial policy. There was a clear change in policy thinking in the connection of the 1990s crisis, from traditional macro policies towards more micro-based policies. At that time, we had a lot of unused human capital because of high unemployment rate and because high level of education. So we had a lot of people with university degree who were unemployed. R&D was to a very little extent outsourced and offshored at that time. There were a lot of basic knowledge jobs available. Innovation policy was more or less towards technical innovations, and then there was also a time when the competitiveness of the country was improving very quickly. But if you take the current crisis, I think that now it's, of course, global crisis, it's global financial crisis, there is a contracting global demand, and the strategy of the policy or of the government is different. There is also maybe a little difference with the policy stance, in the sense that now there is even a shift towards more micro level policies, towards to look what is happening inside the organization, so to retraining people and trying to incentivize individuals, as I said. The weakness of the Finnish system at the moment is, and has been for long actually, that there is relatively weak entrepreneurial spirit. The entrepreneurship is relatively low in Finnish economy, as it is also in other Nordic economies, maybe with the exception of Sweden. Today, quite large part of the R&D is outsourced and partly also offshored. And the jobs that are available now are more or less advanced knowledge jobs. But there is also a change in focus of innovation policies towards more non-technical innovations. I will come back to that. And instead of becoming more competitive on the global scheme, the Finnish economy or the Finnish industries are gradually losing ground. Actually, we are not anymore on the top of, in the global competitiveness comparisons. We have come down a couple of, or not that much, but anyway, we have been losing ground. If you are on the top, there is only, of course, one way to go, and we have seen that in the case of Finland. So these are the maybe the basic differences of the two crises. And now, how was the Finnish response to the current crisis? At this time, the Finnish stimulus or the responses was mostly not related to innovation, while in the crisis of the early 90s, quite a big part of the response was related to innovation. But there is something which is important. I say that it's the automatic stabilizers or the passive mechanisms which have helped a lot in coping with the consequences of the crisis. We also introduced tax reductions on personal taxes, but they were decided already before the crisis, but there happened to be right timing. So there was no need to do this type of fiscal policy actions because they were decided already before. There are some active stimulus mechanisms or stimulus actions also at this time, for example, public works, etc., but they are relatively small. I don't go into any details in that. But saying that, one has to remember that also this time there was a clear response by innovation policies, in the sense that in 2009 there was about 10% increase in government expenditure on R&D, and further about 8% increase last year. And now there is also a plan to introduce the R&D tax incentive system as of January 2012, or it depends on what the new government will decide on that, but I think that might be introduced. Then at the same time, of course, there is this national innovation strategy that was launched already in the early 2008, so before the crisis more or less, and there are some elements which are important also in coping with the crisis. I say a few words about that later, but anyway, there are some new aspects like demand user orientation of innovation strategies, and also the idea having more broad-based innovation policies, including other elements than technological innovation into the policy agenda. There are also some new instruments in the policy toolkit, like the strategic centers for science, technology and innovation, which were introduced also only a few years ago, and which are now in the building up phase. There is some restructuring of the public research organization to be done, not completed yet, but anyway. And most important thing is a university reform. Finland, like many other European countries, has introduced a new university reform. It entered in force in the beginning of 2010. It means in practice that universities got an autonomous position. They are not anymore accounting units of the government budget. They are independent in economic terms. They are independent in terms of science and education. And that means that it's a revolution in a way. After having a relatively rigid system where all the universities were part of the public administration, and now they are independent, either public organizations or private foundations. So there was also a merger of 3 universities at the same time, which is an innovation as such. So the Technical University, Helsinki University of Technology, Helsinki School of Economics, and the University of Art and Design merged, and they are now called Aalto University, which is a university of these 3 previously independent universities, and it is a private foundation at the same time. So this is really a big change in educational policies. I may say something about that later, but this is an important part of the innovation or the research and innovation system, and now the universities have much more autonomy than before, also in terms of how they collaborate with firms, how they raise funds, and how they how they do their task, also, or the so-called third mission, meaning that they are also serving the society in many ways, like collaborating with firms, but also doing something with the civil, with the organizations of ordinary people. So something more concrete about responses to the crisis. Here is the public funding by TEKES. So TEKES is, as Carla said, the Finnish funding agency for technology and innovation, and it's a major or the main player in the Finnish innovation system, in the sense that it gives grants to the firms, but also it finances university research. It has a budget of about 650 million, so it's a major player in a small country. And you can see that public funding for industrial R&D rose during the crisis of the early 90s, because TEKES got more funding or more money from the government budget. And it has also, we see the same also during the current crisis. So there is a counter-cyclical behavior in innovation policy in that sense, and that is, of course, something which reflects the idea also within the innovation policy makers that we should keep the flow of ideas going on, and we should keep the people engaged also during the times when the private firms are cutting their R&D budgets. This is also telling the same story. So if we look at how the government-financed R&D in relation to GDP has developed over the years, we see the years of the early 90s and the increase in the government-financed R&D, and the same for the current crisis, although the sharp rise this time in 2010 is due to the decline in the GDP, of course, rather than a big increase in the government-financed R&D. But there is also an increase in the public R&D expenditure. At the same time, you may see that if you compare the levels of government-financed R&D in Finland and Sweden in comparison with the OECD average or the EU 15 countries, it's much higher. So there is a commitment by the public sector, by the government, to finance R&D. So it's close to 1% in relation to GDP, both in Sweden and Finland, which are the highest figures among the OECD countries. This is a structural phenomenon. And look at, of course, the development in Finland and compare the current situation to the situation in the 1980, when we were ranked very low in this respect, actually, and the rise since then. So that reflects the long-term commitment to R&D by the policy makers or by the government. Then going from the crisis to longer-term issues and to National Innovation Strategy. As I said, it was launched in 2008, and it, of course, identified some strengths and weaknesses of the system, I will discuss this a little bit later. But something about the new strategy, which is, of course, or has some relevance also from the point of view of the current crisis. So main elements or new aspects in the strategy are that there is much more emphasis given on user and demand-driven policies instead of supply-driven policies or technology-driven policies. So in concrete terms, what does it mean? It means new kind of regulatory frameworks and also trying to involve the users of innovation much more in the innovation processes of firms. How to, in a way, stimulate that with policy measures is another thing, but anyway, this might be one of the elements also in the new policies that what Pekka is pursuing, that they take into account very carefully these new aspects. Another aspect is that the policy should be more broad-based than so far. What does that imply? It implies that more emphasis on non-technological innovation, meaning marketing innovation, organizational innovation, etc. More emphasis on services, and I will come back to that later, why that is so important. I mean that services innovation is something which is a weakness in the Finnish system, but on the other hand, that is one of the most potential innovation areas for all smaller countries and for all advanced countries in the face of globalization, which I will discuss in a moment. So in the strategy, it is said that all intangibles, not only technological research and development, but also other aspects of intangible capital should be taken into account, like design, brands, management skills, relational capital, which all the firms or agencies have in one way or another, data banks, etc., etc. So there is a lot of research-based evidence that it's the intangibles, intangible capital that accounts at least half of all economic growth in most advanced countries, including Finland. So we should not talk about only about technology and technology capital, but also other types of intangible factors or intangible assets. Also, the strategy emphasized the international aspects of innovation, stating correctly that innovation is a global matter, and much more so in the future. It also called for even more systemic approach to innovation policies, although, as I said, there has been a long kind of systemic approach in the Finnish innovation policies already by now. And I don't know exactly what is meant by that, but they are referring to the collaboration between different ministries, and especially collaboration between Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Trade and Industry or Ministry of Economy and Employment. There are silos, so differences between different ministries, and there is always a conflict between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Trade and Industry in every country, I think, and the idea is that if we are concerned about long-term economic growth, as the Ministry of Finance should be, they should also be interested in promoting innovation and R&D. That's a simple message of the strategy, and there are even some proposals how to promote this goal, but I don't go into any details of that. One of the proposals of the strategy was that there should be an evaluation, an international independent evaluation of the Finnish national innovation system, and that was actually carried out already in 2009, and that was supposed to be based on the new strategy and the new guidelines given by the strategy. And as I said, my institute and myself, we were quite heavily involved in the evaluation at the time when the system was still functioning relatively or very well indeed. So that's something what one has to respect, that you evaluate something that is performing well, but and that's maybe one of the good features of the Finnish system, that there is a continuous evaluation of not only the system as a whole, but also several aspects and organizations within the system. So the evaluation was completed by the end of 2009, and it's a big book, 300 pages. There is also a policy report, which is a smaller one, and you can find all the material there on the website of the evaluation. The material is still there. We carried out about a dozen of background studies, and it was a very careful evaluation. We had 6 foreign professors from European countries, one from the US, and 5 from the European countries, 6 professors from Finland, and 6 persons from my institute who formed the evaluation panel. So it was a thorough evaluation, and it's very hard to put the results briefly, but there are some observations. So as said, the system, according to evaluation, has been functioning relatively well, but it is at the crossroads in the sense that major changes are needed in organizations, because mainly of the global challenges and because of the fact that many of the organizations have remained relatively similar over the decades, although the innovation environment has changed. One of the things is that the Finnish system was regarded less international than often thought, so several proposals were made to increase the internationalization of the system. Another critical point was that there is a lack of high-growth entrepreneurial firms in Finland, which is true by any international comparisons. If you take the EU comparisons in this respect, you find Finland always ranked very low in terms of new startups or new high-growth entrepreneurs. And another thing was that the system was regarded as relatively complex to access and administer. I think that applies to all countries. Policy systems have a tendency to grow over time, very complex, because new instruments and organizations are always adopted without closing or without giving up of anything. So it means that they grow very complex, and there are always some overlaps. So you should always ask a question when you are introducing a new instrument, that is there already an instrument that is doing the job? If not, then you can maybe consider it, but otherwise you should not introduce anything new, but maybe reform the existing instrument. But this is the tendency the Finnish innovation system has had, and I think that the panel, the evaluation panel, is right when they say that, okay, rather than asking do we have the right committees, institutes and instruments, we should always focus on does the system deliver and how it is performing, and much less attention is paid to that. Politicians tend to solve the problems always in a very simple way, that if there is a problem, they think that, okay, we might invent a new instrument or a new public organization that addresses the problem, and then if there is some public resources available, a new instrument or organization is established and the problem is taken care of. That's the typical way how politicians think, because that's easy and simple, but it does not take into account that this is the way how the system grows very complicated over time, and that is something which every country should think of, that delivering or how the system delivers is the crucial thing, not whether we have the right instruments or organizations, or if there are instruments enough and organizations for that and that purpose. That is not the point. And yet another point made by the evaluation group was that different policies are needed at the frontier. If the country or the economy is at the frontier, what the Finnish economy and the innovation system is at the moment, we need different policies, and I turn to that next. So what kind of policies at the frontier? How does it differ from the policies when you are at the catching up phase? This is a tough question, of course, but first some data about productivity or the being at the frontier. So usually what I mean when I say that we are at the frontier, I refer to the productivity frontier, because after all, that's the only, or ultimately the only measure of competitiveness and the only measure of well-being in the long run. That is competitiveness. That is productivity, sorry. So the more per head you are producing, the more well-being there is, and however internationalized or globalized the economy is, the productivity of the industries and firms who are operating within the national borders, the productivity is the decisive factor. If you want to guarantee the living standards for the citizens, it depends on the level of productivity, what you have inside the borders. And that's why productivity is so important. So we have been doing a lot of analysis of productivity developments and also the factors affecting productivity. And this is only the basic presentation of the current situation. So we look here, the manufacturing industry, which is the easiest sector to look at because the data is usually reliable. You can really compare the countries. So this is based on the EU CLEMS database, and we compare here the US, Sweden, Finland, and Japan. Japan is an interesting case because they have experienced lost decade, or actually 2 lost decades in the economy, and that is mainly due to their inability to increase productivity in the economy. And that is because they are locking in resources in the existing industries and firms. They don't let the creative destruction to do its job. And I may say something more about that, but that is the reason we made a little study with my colleagues about differences between Sweden, Finland, and Japan, and we came to the conclusion that it's quite easy to show the reason for the Japanese poor productivity performance. It is simply that the structural change has not been promoting productivity growth in Japan in the way it has been promoting in Finland. But the story here is that Finland, the blue line, is not a catching up country anymore. We have reached the frontier, the US level, which is often used as a benchmark in productivity comparisons. We have even surpassed the US level and are about the same level as, for example, Sweden. So obviously, different kind of policies is needed, and we have to understand the mechanisms that are behind the productivity increases, and that's more or less about, as I said, creative destruction, about resources moving from less productive units to more productive units. So there are movements in the market shares towards the most productive units, and then you also have to see that the exit mechanism is working. So the poorly performing units are exiting the market, and also the entry mechanism is working so that there will be new firms established all the time, or new units, new plants, if not new enterprises. And that is the mechanism that explains about half of the productivity growth and almost all of the acceleration in the productivity growth in Finland. Almost all of the acceleration of the productivity growth since the late 1980s is explained by what we call creative destruction, so the productivity enhancing structural change, which means that all what I explained, just that the resources are smoothly moving mainly from low productivity units to high productivity units. So obviously different policies are needed, and well, there is another slide showing the non-financial sector, which gives you the same idea that okay, so some services are included here, but the data is a little bit less reliable than in the case of manufacturing, but the picture is exactly the same, with the small difference that in that respect we have not quite reached the US level, but we are quite close. But again, the same thing, that the country was, and the economy was a catching up economy up until the late 1990s, but or up until 90s, but now we are at the frontier. And that is actually what the strategy was emphasizing, that we need still productivity improvement and we need pioneering, and that has to take place under the circumstances where the country has more or less reached the international productivity frontier. So the two goals in the strategy, 2008 strategy, are the most important goals. And now we, as researchers, as evaluators, were trying to analyze how to achieve these goals. And the answer is here on the left-hand side, that if you want to have productivity improvement under the circumstances of being at the frontier, you have to pay more attention to what is happening between the existing units, firms and plants. You have to look at the entry and exit mechanism situation in many cases, or if you are supporting the existing organization, existing firms, it often leads to rigid structures and kind of frozen the existing industrial structure. So you need also, of course, new to the world kind of radical, disruptive innovations rather than less radical. You have to, in a way, put more emphasis on top quality instead of quality in general. So this was the message by the evaluation group, and now we come to what you said earlier, that TEKES, which is the main agency for in the Finnish innovation system, they are already now, or before our evaluation, taking quite high risks compared to what you perceive here. Now they have changed their strategy this year, saying that or stating that they would follow the recommendations or the proposals of the evaluation group and take more risks and focus on fewer projects they are financing and supporting, and at the same time larger projects, and at the same time taking more risks. So this is at least something which I'm very happy with, because we did quite a big job with the evaluation, and now I can see that at least some of the organizations have responded to the evaluation and changed its strategy, and TEKES is one of them. That would mean in practice probably that we should not neglect the small projects and small firms. This is exactly the problem we have in Finland, that we have too few startups, too few small, medium-sized, growth-oriented companies, and it means that for those companies new policy instruments have to be launched, and that's why we also proposed launching the R&D, research and development tax incentive schemes, which is tailor-made for the small, medium-sized companies and also for the startup companies, those who don't have yet any sales or turnover. There are mechanisms also for those in tax-based innovation policies. So there will be a change in policies probably in the near future, both in what TEKES is doing and in terms of tax-based policies. So the rest of my speech I use for looking at some specificities of the Finnish innovation system, how the Finnish system deviates from other countries or the systems in other countries. If I have time, I think that we have plenty of. There we go. Okay, it takes about 10 minutes or less. Okay. So, of course, the first thing is that the R&D intensity is very high. So Finland is one of the 3 countries at the top of the world. So together with Israel, where you are going next, and Sweden. And another specific feature is that if you look at to what extent the public sector or the government is supporting the enterprise sector, the business sector R&D, it is very little actually, and it has always been. So we have high intensity, R&D intensity, but it is not because the government is subsidizing R&D activities in the business sector, but it is because the public agencies, public organizations are doing quite a lot of R&D, and because the private sector is doing most of the job. And here you see again the responses to the crisis in the early 90s, especially when the government financed R&D in business enterprise sectors increased quite rapidly, and this is a clear sign of the policies which was a response to crisis at that time. Of course, a special feature of the Finnish system is not only that the public sector has a relatively small role and business sector has a big role, but within the business sector, Nokia is playing still a very, very big role. So about 50% of all business sector R&D in Finland is carried out by Nokia, and it remains to be seen what happens in the near future, while Nokia at the moment is in big troubles, as we know. It has an alliance with Microsoft, and we don't know yet what will be the outcome of that alliance. What does it mean for the R&D of Nokia in Finland, or Finland-based R&D of Nokia? But it will we will see it in a couple of months, I guess. But by the end of this year, what kind of rearrangement or reorganizations they will do. In any case, they will reduce their R&D staff in Finland. So another important feature of the system is that there is a lot of collaboration between universities and research institutes and the business firms in Finland. When you do this type of comparative surveys, Finland is always ranked very high. So it looks that this is a peculiar Finnish characteristics or feature, but also other smaller countries seem to be collaborating, or in other countries there seems to be a lot of collaboration between universities, research institutes and business firms. And then there are some results of a study or survey carried out a couple of years ago, how easy it is to collaborate with universities, so how the firms perceive the collaboration or cooperation with universities. It looks that it's relatively easy to cooperate in Finland and also again in other Nordic countries. And finally, a few words about future challenges for smaller economies. I think that what is happening on the global scale is that there are major changes going on the global R&D scheme, meaning simply that those pioneering big countries are losing ground, and there are new countries, emerging countries, who are entering the global R&D scheme. And by far, so far, the US is by far the biggest R&D spender in the world. About 30% of all R&D carried out worldwide is carried out by the US or in the US, within the US borders. Japan is number 2, but China is already number 3 and very close to Japan. And if you look at the changes in over the last 10 years, you see that the countries that have been biggest spenders, Japan, the US, Japan, France, Germany, they are losing their, let's say, global shares in R&D, and at the same time, countries like China, Korea are increasing their share very rapidly indeed. And at the same time, this picture is telling a story which is important for the small countries, that in absolute terms, Finland, while we are showing a very high R&D intensity, so R&D expenditure in relation to GDP, we are very, very small players in a global perspective. Only 0.6% of all R&D carried out in the world is carried out in Finland. So we are tiny player globally. And that's something we have to always keep in mind. So some of the big multinational corporations are spending much more, or at least the same amount as the whole Finnish manufacturing or industry sector. So we are competing in a different way than the bigger countries. Another thing which is important on a global scale is the Chinese-led manufacturing development. If you look at what is happening with the manufacturing prices in the world trade, you can see that if you deflate the manufacturing prices by the price deflator of the OECD GDP deflator, there is a constant decline in the manufacturing prices since China entered the global economy in the late 1970s, meaning that competing globally in manufacturing with China is very hard for anyone. And that is the global market which one has to keep in mind. So China is competing very heavily in almost all industries you can imagine, in almost all manufacturing industries. And the price that the firms coming from developing countries, from developed countries, from advanced countries, which they face in the world market, is something that is declining in real terms, so to speak, all the time. So this is a rough macro picture of the world economy, which makes it really hard to compete in manufacturing. And that is the reason why we have to pay much more attention to services. And that is the reason why we emphasized in the strategy so much services, and that is the reason why we talked so much about services in the evaluation. But in the case of Catalonia, or in the case of Finland, I think that most of the services that will be competitive on a global scale have some connection to manufacturing, some connection to industry. If you look at the case of Finland and ask what is the biggest exporter of services from Finland, what industry it is the technology industry. And if we ask what is the biggest exporter of services, what company is the biggest exporter, it's by far Nokia. Second is Kone, which is an elevator company, which we always regard as a manufacturing company. And all the big manufacturing companies are among the biggest exporter of services from Finland. And that is, of course, the opportunity which is open for smaller countries to combine services and manufacturing capabilities. So these are my conclusions, and I have more or less used the time reserved for me. So one of the conclusions I want to make is that innovation and knowledge creation spur long-term economic growth, and that's why it is so important to discuss innovation, research, and education. Something about responses to the crisis. I think that there is no need to repeat what I said already, but I think that we have to keep in mind that we should not, or we should let the creative destruction to do its job also during the crisis, which would maybe guarantee the long-term growth. Preventing or slowing down structural change is bad policies. And if we want to find some advantages of smaller countries, I think that we can find them in flexibility and in their ability to react fast and to make fast decision if needed. And that is something which is the case in Finland at least, that when there is a crisis or when there has been a recession and when fast decision making has been needed, it has been possible to do so. And in the case of Estonia, I guess, which we heard just recently, that has been the case. Okay, that's more or less what I had in mind. Thank you so much.